Vice President Mike Pence led a National Space Council meeting this morning. He said the United States will not only return to the moon, but return with objectives.
Because unlike a half century ago, this time, our objective will be to establish a permanent presence on the lunar surface, and from there we will develop the capabilities to journey to the red planet of Mars. In order for us to take the next big leap toward the Martian surface, you all here know that we have to demonstrate that we can live on the moon for months and even years.
According to Politico, Newt Gingrich, an Air Force Lieutenant General, and Michael Jackson's former publicist all want President Trump to sign on to a new plan to get Americans on the moon. It includes a $2 billion sweepstakes pitting billionaires Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and other space pioneers against each other to see who can establish and run the first lunar base. Bryan Bender is defense editor for Politico. He joins me now from Tempe, Arizona. Bryan, thanks very much for being with us. So explain this to us. How does this proposed sweepstakes compare to NASA's anticipated plan to get people back on the moon?
So this is billed as not an alternative way to get to the moon, but a parallel effort. And Speaker Gingrich and this sort of eclectic group of space enthusiasts and NASA skeptics think that we're putting all our eggs in one basket, that effectively NASA is in charge, in many ways is approaching this the way it's approached the space program for decades. And, you know, the president has laid out a very fast timeline to do this, 2024, to send an astronaut back to the moon. And the thinking here is that we now have all these private companies, SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others that have these big plans to go to the moon as well for economic, industrial reasons. Why not try and encourage that as well? And so that's where this competition idea comes from. $2 billion is not going to fund the whole moon program, but it could be a way to jumpstart all of this innovation that's going on in the private sector among companies that are not traditionally NASA contractors. And so the hope is that if you got this going, you have sort of these two parallel efforts going on that better ensures that America gets back to the moon, gets there pretty quickly, and stays in the lead, because we now have lots of competitors. The Chinese, the Indians, the Europeans, the Russians possibly are also trying to do this.
Well, why do advocates of this plan think that NASA's plan isn't sufficient?
Well, NASA's plan relies on a couple of very big programs. One is the Space Launch System, or SLS. The main contractors for that are Boeing and Lockheed Martin. And that's a program that is much delayed, way over budget. And there's growing concern that that rocket and the capsule that goes on top of it, called the Orion, will not be ready in time for the president's vision of 2024 to be met. The SLS costs NASA about $2 billion per year. And obviously this competition is talking about $2 billion overall to encourage some of these private companies to compete.
Well, is there any indication that these private companies could actually set up permanent housing on the moon in the next decade?
Well, they certainly say they can. I mean, that's certainly what they're claiming they can do. I mean, Elon Musk, who's the founder of SpaceX, in fact, he tweeted, I think, overnight that he thought this was a great idea, this competition proposal. Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin has also laid out publicly that they hope to go to the moon within a few short years and start establishing more permanent presence there. I think a moon base probably initially could not include humans yet. I think there's a lot of ways through robotics that you could start setting the groundwork for a permanent settlement on the moon, and then astronauts would come later to operate it. So within a decade, I think most people would say is certainly possible. By 2024, might be a little bit of a long shot.
And help us understand, how big of a role is Newt Gingrich playing in all of this?
Well, the former House Speaker is always been kind of a policy wonk. And he's always, at least for many, many years, had an abiding interest in space exploration. Back in 2012, when he ran for the presidential nomination in the Republican Party, he got sort of poked fun at a little bit, I think, in one of the debates where he said one of the things he wanted to do as president was to set up a moon base. And the speaker has a pretty close relationship with the Trump administration. The president likes him. From what I understand, he sort of plays a quasi-unofficial advisory role. So, Gingrich teamed up with a former Congressman, Bob Walker from Pennsylvania, a Republican who headed the Science Committee, is a longtime space consultant. General Steve Quast, who's in the Air Force, about to retire, a three-star general who has had a little bit of a public spat with the Air Force leadership about the way ahead in space. And then this, as you mentioned earlier, Howard Bloom was sort of a music industry pioneer, publicist for lots of famous rock and pop music bands. But in the last decade or so has also sort of morphed into the space world, created something called the Space Development Committee, which is this loose network of people who really feel strongly that it's time to do things differently when it comes to exploring space, and that NASA, instead of being the only game in town, should sort of serve this role as convener of all of these new companies, all of these new ideas, and try and encourage them to do things more from a private sector approach to industrialize space rather than a government-only, taxpayer-funded way to do it.
It'll certainly be a shift from what we have seen in terms of NASA's role in the past. All right, Bryan Bender for us. Bryan, thank you.
Thank you.